Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending, and I'm sorry for the dog eating a toilet roll noises in the background. I'm Dr. Kit, also known as the Bee Vet, and I am talking to you about the Australian native bee industry. And I say industry because it's not really um, a fully blown industry at the moment, and there's a lot happening in the native bee sphere. Some things are good, some things need some working on. And so that's what I'm going to be discussing with you today. And I'd also love to hear your thoughts as well. And if you have any questions too. So I want to talk about native bee research and the native bee industry, where it's at, what needs to be done, and what needs to be communicated. And I think memes are a really amazing way of succinctly sharing some information. So there's quite a few memes here, as you'll see on the slides. And just this one here, a lot of people think that keeping honeybees in their backyard represents actions to save the bees, and as I'll be describing soon, that's probably not a very good idea for wild bee conservation. And even some of the native bee so-called conservation actions that are happening at the moment, whilst they probably have great intentions, they can be doing more harm than good. So let's start off with the native bee industry. What is it? So it's still an emerging industry. AgriFutures identifies it as an emerging industry. It's very new, very recent, and recently there was a strategic RD&E plan that was developed with consultation of native bee researchers, especially the sugar bag beekeepers, and unfortunately it is very much focused on a very small subset of Australian bees, the sugar bag bees. These are the Meliponini. They are the eusocial ones. In particular, the Tetragonula carbonaria is the main one that is kept in hives. And that's very attractive because, like honeybees, you can keep them, you can harvest very small amounts of honey, use them for pollination services, but they are a very small part of native bee biodiversity as a whole. We've had 3 native bee conferences to date. So I basically entered the native bee sphere at a very good time. I think it was the second year of my PhD that we had the first native bee conference, and there's been 2 others, and I'm sure there'll be many more. And every conference, it's getting more and more diverse and what we're working on. The last one was probably not as big as the previous one because we're just coming out of COVID, but the first and second one were really buzzing. Now, the problem is these conferences are awesome, but outside of the conferences, it's hard to know what everyone's working on. There's minimal communication, and you never know the sort of opportunities that you're missing out on. You can miss out on collaborations, and then also people can be working on the same thing and miss out on cross-pollinating ideas. And people can also maybe sometimes get a little bit touchy if numerous people are working on the same thing and you don't realize it, and then it becomes, it's a very competitive field, academia. So there can be some drawbacks, but the conference is a really great way of connecting, making friends, making connections, but it's also very limited to people that can afford to go to the conferences, because conferences, this one is relatively affordable, but conferences can be really expensive. You have to pay to go to conferences and present your research, or pay to listen. So also if they're in, like when I was in Western Australia, they were on the other side of the country. And so that's a fair bit of travel and, air flights and accommodation. So it can be a little bit restrictive, and, your everyday person, it's a lot to sort of fork out to go and find out what's happening in the native bee industry. And as a whole, the native bees of Australia are still very much overshadowed by honeybees. There's so much more research and funding and media attention that goes into honeybees. And even with the native bees, as I mentioned, it's mainly focused on the sugar bag bees. So whilst there's been so much that's been happening and it's really advancing in the last few years, we still have a long way to go. So just putting these slides up here quite briefly, but you can see some of the like diverse things that were presented in the last Native Bee conference, and we had great things about the natural history of native bees, and that's a great thing about conferences. Sometimes you can present things that might not be like huge journal articles published in high impact factor journals, but you can learn so much about the little observations that people are working on, those little important, interesting details that sometimes don't make the actual academic articles. So we've got things about bee behavior. There's a lot more community engagement. Of course, stingless bee products, not just the stingless bee honey, but propolis, and the resins. So that's just some of the research that was presented in the most recent Native Bee conference, which was last year in June, I believe. And then we've got, again, stingless bees, stingless bee management, crop pollination, largely with stingless bees, a little bit with the native bees, but you can see there is a very big focus on the stingless bees even within the Australian Native Bee Conference. So what are we missing out on? So sorry, my dog is making strange noises in the background. I am sorry about that. So taxonomy. So this is the description and the description of new species and organization of species into their phylogeny, their evolutionary relationships. Now, Australia is, you know, a first world country. You'd think that would be sort of like, you know, on there with our native bee taxonomy, but we are really lagging behind. So there is currently 1,661 described species, which is a lot. But there's estimated to be at least 2,000 species of native bees. So that means that there are literally hundreds more that are undescribed. And I can verify when you go to the entomology collection at a museum, there are so many specimens there that are undescribed. There's very limited investment into taxonomy as well. The main taxonomy grant, you need 50% co-funding. So that's a major hurdle at the start. And it's for taxonomy, not of bees, of everything across Australia. So limited investment into taxonomy, and this is the backbone of everything. If we don't have a good taxonomy, a good understanding of how many species there are, this is the metric, the basic metric of biodiversity. If something isn't described and named, it can't really be listed and given conservation protection. And even of the species that are described, some of the descriptions were done 100 or so years ago, and really they could be any bee. There's no pictures, there's no photos, it's just like black with verruginous hairs 2 lines long, which is not helpful at all. And you know, there's taxonomic keys, dichotomous keys are really helpful when you're trying to identify what species you have. Lots of genera don't have these, and many species don't have DNA barcodes. We're now moving into an era where if you want to describe a species, you need to have the genetic data, and that's really come to the forefront. Me and my colleague James Dorey are working on a paper where with barcoding, we found that a species that was described based on just a male, and there was a species that was described just on the female, and they were actually the same species, but because they were described based on one sex, there's now 2 species that need to be synonymized, and there's probably many more that are like that. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I wanted to point out my most recent one that I described, Leoproctus zephyr. This one named after my dog. So this species, before I described it, no one knew about it, no one cared about it, but it only occurs in a handful of locations on the Swan Coastal Plain, which is heavily urbanized. It only visits 2 species in the same genus of plant, so very, very specialized. And before I described it, no one cared. So I'm really glad that now people are starting to take notice of native bees and hopefully protect the areas it's in. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. So sustainability as well is a big issue. So honeybee competition, this is such a contentious issue and people can get very heated about it. The fact of the matter is that honeybees are an introduced species. They're like cows, they are livestock. They are really important for the Australian economy. No one is denying that. We need honeybees for pollinating many of the also introduced exotic crops. Honeybees are very, very resilient, which is why they're not threatened with extinction. But we need to be aware that we need to keep them sustainably and make sure that there are enough resources in the environment so that honeybees don't take more resources that is required, and so there's not enough for the native bees. So we need honeybees, but we really need native bees, and we need to recognize honeybees need to be recognized as managed species. And when they go into the wild and they go feral, then they're feral species like feral cats. Like I love cats. I have a kitten myself, but cats shouldn't be out there in the wild. And same with honeybees. They have their place, but not in the wild. They shouldn't be in conservation parks that should be dedicated to native bee conservation. Saying that can get people very enraged, but we really need to have areas that are dedicated to biodiversity conservation. But there's also the issue of sugar bag bees. So they are native, but they're also managed, and there are unfortunately some actions that are going on where people are putting loads of sugar bag bees into areas, including after bushfires where there's not as many resources. And my research project last year was finding that in areas that have been burnt, that's when honeybee competition was occurring with the native bees. I was in Western Australia, so there are no sugar bag bees there, but sugar bag bees are also a eusocial species, and moving loads of sugar bag bee species into areas after they've been burnt could cause competition between the sugar bag bees and the solitary native bees. And moving sugar bag bees about outside of their ranges is also quite contentious. So they could compete, solitary bees. So I think we need to have better management of managed colonies, be it sugar bag bees or be it honey bees. Think about sustainability. So how much can the local environment sustain? In areas where there have been bushfires, in urban areas where there might not be as many native plants, probably there needs to be lower densities of honeybees and probably the sugar bag bees as well. And also moving hives outside of their native range is not a good idea. Even moving native, like solitary bees. So recently there has been a project which is not very good in that people have been putting up bee hotels in natural areas, which is fine. It gives bees, extra resources to nest in, provided they are designed well. But then they're moving these bee hotels with the bees in them into areas outside of their natural range, into areas that have been burnt. So burnt areas, typically less resources, moving bees outside their native range. What this can lead to is you're essentially depleting populations of native bees, putting them into areas that have been burnt where the bees, if there's not enough resources for them, they're just going to die. And it's such a bad idea. So yeah, there is like, it's good that people are starting to think about native bees, but sometimes it's better if we don't do things like that because it can be causing a lot more harm. Because yeah, moving solitary bees into new areas, kilometers away from where they are, areas that probably don't have the resources they require, very bad idea, and that's happening. So yeah, there's some amazing, great research and conservation that's going on, but there's also some things that are going on that are harming the native bees. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to resolve the taxonomy, even the Meliponini, the sugar bag bees. That's unresolved. There's species that have been barcoded that aren't matching described species, especially more in, areas in the Northern Territory, in traditional landowner lands. The sugarbag bees are obviously really important to these people. They still rely on them for sustenance, and some of those species there are undescribed. So taxonomy, natural history as well. We need to invest in understanding how bees live, how they nest, what they forage on. There's still so many things that this basic information. So just saying, oh, plant flowers and the bees will come, that's not the case. Many of our native bees are very specialized, they're fussy. So if you have a garden full of flowers, if it's full of exotic flowers, you're probably just going to be providing for a small subset of general bees that are probably doing okay anyway. We need to look at what the solitary specialist bees are foraging on, what they prefer, and also how they prefer the plantings in terms of should we be planting them in particular configurations. Still, we don't know that sort of thing. We don't know the foraging heights of so many native bees, nesting especially. So many native bees, we don't know where they nest, their soil preferences, especially the ground nesting bees. We know very little about how to help and encourage them to nest. So even if we know native bees like particular flowers, if they don't have the nesting resources within the vicinity that they forage in, then we're not really going to be catering to all their needs. Geographic distribution, that's another thing we don't know. We don't know how they're shifting in relation to climate change. And sadly, we don't have sort of monitoring and baseline understanding of biodiversity of areas or of species. So that's something that we need to start doing, actually monitoring species, their phenology and limiting factors. Is it competition? Is it nesting sites? Is it temperature? So many things like predators that we don't really know about. So it's exciting because there's so much to discover, but also concerning that we don't know some of the really basic important things about native bees and the life history that are so important for conservation of these amazing species. So what do we need to communicate? Well, there needs to be more research communicated and promotion of native bees, and not just by academics. There are, organizations that are working with native bees, and it'd be great to have their actions being monitored and also published as well. Because there's lots of community groups that are doing things like planting gardens or community gardens or pollinator strips or verges, but it'd be great to monitor this and make sure that it is having the desired effect. And what's being communicated to the public as well is quite limited, and it's dominated by a few universities that have great PR teams. And to be honest, like lots of academics, they hate social media, and that is completely understandable because social media can be awful. But it is the main way that people get to learn about native bees. So having a good communication strategy is really important. And we need great incentive to publish research, including even things, for example, by environmental consultancies. There's probably so much data out there that is hidden away in consultancy reports or government reports that would be really important for us to know plant-pollinator interactions or the distribution of species. But at the moment, if you want to make your work open access, you have to pay often thousands of dollars. And if the public want to read research that isn't open access, they have to pay. There are sneaky ways to get around it, like uploading things to ResearchGate. SciFub is another way to get access to research, but it's very difficult to make your research openly available, readily findable without having to pay thousands of dollars. And if you're not associated with a research institution that can pay those things, then yeah, it makes it difficult. Less sexy stories need to be communicated. There's so much into sort of genetics and new technologies, but sometimes going back to the basics, just going and observing and firstly understanding your species, what they do, their life history, life history traits. Those just little natural history notes can be really interesting. They might not be involving massive projects with eDNA, but they are really important for understanding our native bees. And greater promotion of niche topics. So moving away from honey, everyone loves honey and beekeeping, to just random observations that are super important to understanding our native bees. And again, the communication strategy is really important. You can make the most, what would appear to be a very bland thing, very, very sexy to the public if you communicate it in the right way. So how can we all contribute to native bee conservation? So there's a lot of details that we need to look at. So unfortunately, very broad brush messages sometimes can, as I said, cause more harm than good. So rather than just planting more flowers, we need to plant the right flowers, especially the ones that our specialist native bees forage on. So the Metaceae, the Fabaceae, things like that. So there's a call to increase sugar bag bees. Sometimes this is important and good, but we need to make sure it is within the bounds of the environment. There's also a lot of calls to ban herbicides. This needs to be more nuanced as well. If you're using herbicides to get rid of invasive grasses, that's actually a really good thing. Unfortunately, there has been very limited research on the effect of many herbicides and pesticides on our native bees. And there's been many publications coming out of things like the UK and USA that are showing that the responses of honeybees cannot be the same as that of native bees. So we really need to be looking at detailed studies on native bees and, for example, the fipronil baiting that's going on to destroy honeybee hives in areas where there's varroa mite. That's never been tested on native bees. We don't know whether they're attracted to it. We don't know the toxicity and their effect on the native bees. So that's another sort of big knowledge gap that should be filled. Same with like pesticides and herbicides that are being applied to many crop fields. We need to know how they're impacting the native bees. Installing bee hotels can be good. So I put up lots of bee hotels in areas where there'd been fires. I didn't take the bee hotels away. They were put there to provide extra nesting resources, and they were all occupied. And it was based on designs that I previously tested during my PhD and shown the bees not only use them, but then they develop and successfully emerge. And Katya has been doing some amazing work with their colleagues on Kangaroo Island, creating specifically well-designed, I wouldn't really call them bee hotels, but bee nesting substrates for the Xylocopa there. And that was going really well until there was like a devastating fire, and then honeybees also put in those areas. But again, so bee hotels, artificial nesting substrates can be really effective for helping boost populations, but we shouldn't be using them to have bees nest in them and take them away to areas where there might be not many resources. And making sure that the bee hotels are designed well. So the Mr. Fothergill's ones that you can pick up from Bunnings or Aldi, not designed very well. Same with the seed mixes there, mainly exotics. So if you want to also contribute to some data collection, I have a Facebook group called the Buzz and Wild Bees, and there is a bee hotel citizen science project that's been going on there a while, where I just want to see what bee hotels people are creating. Are the bees using them? You can share photos of native bees. This has been really cool because there's been some observations that I've been able to publish. For example, the introduced African carder bee, Pseudoanthidium repetidum. It was thought to not be in Western Australia. It had been introduced on the East Coast and then was found to have been established in Western Australia. I didn't discover that. Someone else put a photo up there, and I was like, that's not a bee that is native to around here. I was able to go to their place and confirm it. There's been other observations posted on there, so you can definitely make some amazing groundbreaking discoveries by just keeping an eye out for native bees and sharing what you see. And I love seeing people's native bee photos from all around Australia. It's really cool because I love bees and biodiversity. and I can help you ID the native bees as well. And getting people familiar with the taxonomic names rather than common names can go a good way in communicating taxonomy and the scientific way of talking about species and understanding how they are all related. So, if you'd like to learn more about how to make a good bee hotel and the flowers that native bees like, I have a book. You can email me for that. If you'd like to learn about the taxonomy of native bees and how to identify them, again, I also have a little ID guide. And if you'd like to learn about a cool native bee and its sexy natural history, I've got a book about Amygilla dorsoni. And I also have a Redbubble store where I've created murals that are just a simple way of getting the message out there about what sort of things the native bees like, about our different native bees, and raising awareness. And I've also got some bingo cards for you to try and find the native bees in your area. I've got a YouTube channel too. If you want some more native bee content, you can subscribe to that. And if you are interested in anything about native bees, collaborating, any workshops, photographs, you can get in touch by my socials there. And I'd really like to thank the AgriFutures Capacity Building Grant for providing me with a grant to go and do workshops and present remotely at the conference. Really thankful to my beeple, my bee colleagues. It's great to be able to throw ideas around and discuss these really important issues. And I haven't listed her there, but that's because I only recently started collaborating with her, but Amy Marie Gilpin, she's really cool too. And to everyone, all of you here for being interested in hearing about what's happening, what some of the issues in the native bee industry are. So to the floor, we have 7.5 minutes before the Zoom runs out. So if you have your questions, throw them at me. And feel free to email me if you'd like to discuss any of these things further. But yeah, if you have a question, feel free to put your hand up or unmute yourself, and we'll go from there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Sonia.
Okay, well, I know there's a lot of really in the know people here, but I'm just like a regular person. I bought 5 acres. I love bees. Bees are like my spirit animal. So I'm on a different level. I'm Joe Public, okay? And it's like I've been following your work for so long and I share everything. And it's just like I get so frustrated on social media and I'm just like, why don't people care? You know? As a gardener and a property owner, I'm trying to do the self-sustainability thing. I mean, I love all bees. I don't care what they are. I watch them. I've been watching them for years. I've been trying to figure them all out, and I know what they like to visit and everything else. How do you get that? This needs to go, be everyone that has a garden, It's like,
so much,
how
Sonia,
do you
for
get it
your
out there?
enthusiasm.
I'm so frustrated with that.
Well, it's
It's
people like you,
important.
to be honest. Like, as you said, the average person, but you're not average.
Yep.
So you're not average, but people like you who are enthusiastic and you can lead by example because, yeah, sometimes people don't like listening to researchers because they think we're in our ivory towers.
Well, yeah,
And
you do use big words, but I kind of like that too because I'd rather go to the source to learn than a Bunnings blurb. Oh, hello.
yeah,
So
so
you know what I mean? Mm-hmm.
and I guess there's a lot of you know, I guess messages that need to be changed a little bit because everyone, understands that bees are important and we need to save the
Yeah,
bees. And unfortunately, it's been dominated by a particular narrative that isn't
that's
quite
right.
correct. And
Exactly. Oh yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
and I think that's the
Mhm.
challenge because people don't like having their, I guess their ideologies challenged.
Mm.
So it's
A lot of people just don't know, and you just can't put it right in front of their nose, you know? So
yeah.
yeah, I'm interested in putting it right in front of people's noses.
Thanks, Sonia. Well, I think you've been doing a great job, and yeah, I really
Yeah,
appreciate like people like you know, supporting the native bee cause.
I try. I do my bit.
Thank you. And we've got some great discussions happening in the chat as well. And so Katya also has a really great point that we need to um, start at schools because kids, you know, they're the ones that are our future, right? And fortunately, many schools are starting to have the native bee component in it. You know, I've been invited to talk to lots of schools and homeschool groups, but when I was at school, like native bees, I had no idea they existed, not a thing at all. So yeah, getting the message out among kids, kids will go home and tell the parents. So schools are a great way, I think, of getting the message out there, getting kids interested because yeah, they're literally the future. So definitely having that, you know, education from the start, so they don't have the wrong narrative that needs to be overwritten from the start. They'll understand bees as a whole. So we've also got some ideas about uh, local council land management and how at the moment they're focusing still on, you know, the big animals and they forget the smaller fauna and flora, and that is totally true. So much investment after the bushfires into koalas. Everyone loves koalas, they're cute and all that, but you know, they're compared with some native bees, they're doing actually pretty well. So definitely we need to start including native bees into monitoring, into environmental impact assessments. They're going to tell us more about the health of a restored site than whether there's a koala there or not. Um, so some of the other things that we've had, oh, um, Costa mentioned me. Yay. Thanks. Thanks, Fiona. And oh yeah, Cormac. So Cormac is amazing. He's working in Canberra with all types of bees, which is really exciting. So he's there on all the different places and he has a book coming out sometime. It's been written. And I've had a little read and it's very good. So stay tuned for that. But he pointed out that yeah, there's 1,661 described species, only a handful, I think four of them are federally listed. So that is a, you know, that is not much at all. And believe me, there are many more that should be listed. And myself and some colleagues, we looked at basically the distribution of bees after the bushfires, and based on this mapping, there was, I think, at least maybe eight that should definitely be listed. So this is just based on distributions from fire, but there's many other threats that are going on, and many of them we couldn't even analyze because there wasn't enough data, which could mean that they're not even there anymore, or people haven't gone and seen if they're still there. So lots of limitations. Um, we've got uh, Sonia telling us some success stories, which is awesome. It's always nice to know some success stories. Information about the best local native plants for native bees. Thank you for Fiona for plugging my book. So my book has a list, and you can also just, if you look at the species and your local native nursery, so native nurseries are really good. Your local native nursery doesn't have that particular species. It's okay. Look at one in the same genus. So very few native bees are so specialized they'll only forage on, say, one plant species. So we have less than a minute left. So I'm just going to say thank you so much to everyone who's been attending. If you have any questions, again, shoot me through a message. But it's been really great to hear your thoughts and discuss these ideas with you. So thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your evening.